Hello and welcome to the Inheritance Podcast. I'm Joe Riley, head of Circulus Group, which is a forum for the family office world. We're hosting our first family office event in New York on September 19th. If you are a single family office and would like to attend, you can request an invite on our Substack, which is circulus.substack.com. There's a link available under events, and it will also be included in the show notes. We're happy to have Steve Tannenbaum of Golden Tree joining us, and we'll be covering private equity, fintech, family wealth, and the global macro outlook with many talented speakers. I hope you can join us. Christian Stewart is a consultant in Hong Kong who started Family Wealth Legacy to help successful Asian families establish communication platforms and decision-making structures for their family enterprise. Christian works with enterprising families as a process consultant, coach, and family meeting facilitator. He helps families to form their own family council, family constitution, and family policies, often in the context of planning for succession. He is a prolific author of excellent articles, which are available on his website, and the winner of many awards recognizing his thought leadership. We had a rich conversation. Christian thinks succession should be thought of as a design process that breaks down the succession plan into manageable components. For patriarchs consumed with management succession, Stewart gently reframes the narrative. He says you have to invest in developing the human, intellectual, and social capitals within the family. He talks about the deep influence from Jay Hughes on his work and elaborates on the interesting idea of co-regulating emotionally with his clients and the importance of meditation to his own work. Succession for Christian is not a transaction, but a multi-generational architectural feat. Christian Stewart is the founder of Family Legacy Asia. He was previously a managing director at JP Morgan Private Bank and head of wealth advisory in Asia. He was at PricewaterhouseCoopers in Hong Kong before that, as a partner and head of the Trust and Private Client Group. Previously, he practiced law in Australia. Christian holds a Bachelor of Laws from the University of Adelaide. Please enjoy my excellent conversation with Christian Stewart.
This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Anything said by the guests or host should not be construed as legal or investment advice. Thanks for listening.
If you want to talk a little bit about your own background and what you studied as an undergrad.
So I went to university in Australia. So we have a different system. It's probably closer to the English university system. I didn't do an undergrad. And it's one of those things I regret in later life. So I was very studious when I was in secondary school. I got very good results in secondary school. I always had this family message that I was going to be a doctor or a lawyer. And so I was aiming for law. And in my day, you could just go straight into law. And so I just did a 4-year pure law degree in South Australia. And which was talking to old friends who did the similar thing in the past. It's like it was a vocational thing. It was like going and doing something so you can go and get a job into a specific profession. And only in later life that I look back and I think, wow, I wish I'd done arts and all those other interesting things, which at the time weren't interesting to me.
Did you ever, growing up, consider different careers?
No. My father was a farmer and sheep farm in the border, close to the South Australian border in Western Victoria. Yeah. So my ambition in youth was to get off the farm.
But you never considered other careers?
And I never considered other careers. But it was lucky because I'm very interested in the kind of work that I do today. And so for me, it's been an evolution. And having been a lawyer, I focused on trusts. When I was in Australia, I qualified. I worked in Australia for 4 years before following some friends to Hong Kong. So at the time, I was interested in sort of tax and trust in a very domestic Australian context. And when I got to Hong Kong, found an opportunity to carry over some of the trust work or trust knowledge that I had from Australia. And I helped PwC at the time rebuild a trust and estate planning practice. And part of that was just pure luck. But doing that trust work at PwC, in the time I was there, they still had a Hong Kong estate duty. And so that gave me the exposure to working with wealthy families in Hong Kong and working with, in Asia, the trusts always tend to have institutional trustees. We don't, as a practice. So a lot of the trust work is there's a culture to trust work. Part of the trust work culture in Asia is that you're working with the institutional trustees, the private bank trustees. So that kind of got me into that.
Is that different from the way it is in Australia?
Oh, yes. In Australia, there's usually one or two state-level trust corporations, but they're more likely to be focused on estate administration. And the very common practice in Australia was you set up a private company and you have the asset contributor and his or her spouse as the shareholders and directors. Yeah. So then so that's every man and his dog has got it. And then you come to Hong Kong and, in my days, there was a guy called Professor Peter Willoughby, and he was like, oh, but that's a sham. Like, how does that work? So it's just different places, different practices, different issues.
Why does he think it was a sham?
Everything was a sham. The region I'm in now is a very English influenced, the sort of the offshore jurisdictions, which are predominantly English law originated. Of course, that's not accurate. So I think his idea was that people are not really giving up dominion and control over the assets if they're continuing to act as trustee. And another one is that do people really know what they're doing when you get businessmen basically acting as trustees for themselves? But in Australia, the trust law issues that they looked at were very form over substance. That's probably wrong, right? But it was all about, have we complied with the law in Saunders and Vautier? Have we got this provision right? One of the really, I have to say this, I can't help myself. One of the really funny things about Australia is that this practice when you set up Australia is you get your solicitor to put in $10 and he's called the settlor of the trust. And then I shouldn't use the word client, but you know what I mean, the principal then comes in and can gift whatever. The practice is the guy who put in the $10 is the settlor. So it's have we got the paperwork right in Australia? Whereas I came to Hong Kong and I met people like Professor Willoughby and it was quite challenging and some of the Cayman lawyers at the time, because in Hong Kong, I got woken up to, in Hong Kong, which is more of that English and international, it's more what's going on in substance. Australia was a lot about the form. Internationally, it's what about the substance?
Technically, they both came from the same root, from English common law, correct?
Correct. Yes. So court-wise, Australia has its own sort of evolutions, but it is the same tree. But practice-wise, I think in Australia, maybe for whatever reason, you have a lot of it is driven by domestic tax. So just different cultures. But coming back to my personal story, like when I first landed in Hong Kong, I ended up at Pricewaterhouse. I was wandering around thinking, okay, what can I do? Because I can't read a balance sheet and don't want to do profits tax returns. And I was just lucky. They gave me space. And I discovered these estate duty planning files that they had with the law firm Johnson Stokes and Masters, which was like the famous estate duty planning firm in Hong Kong in those days. And my story was like, they were using these trust deeds in Hong Kong, which were private unit trusts, which was a feature of the Hong Kong estate duty planning. And these things were all drafted by a QC from Australia that I'd heard about. And so I was lucky, like I landed in Hong Kong and with my Australian legal background, I was like one of the few people that could actually look at this planning which was being done and say, oh, I understand where this is coming from, what's being done.
Sorry, what's a QC?
Queen's Counsel.
Okay.
Yeah, so very senior level of barrister. So.
And how did your early work as a solicitor affect the way that you look at family wealth?
That's a great question. And I think I've said something like this before, because I think of my career as a progression, as a lockstep thing. And so I've been running away from the law. Like I tell people, if somebody came to me and said, can you help me do a trust? I'd say, no, I don't do that. Yet I do still do a lot of trust work for old existing clients, and like it's quite valuable. So maybe the legal practice doesn't influence what I do today, but that trust knowledge is immensely practical and a really important part of what I'm doing today. And I'll say two further things about that. And this is a conversation with Jay Hughes as well. So I'm in Asia, and a lot of the focus in the sort of family wealth planning in Asia is around family business. Today, obviously, we're seeing a lot of new family offices or investment offices being created. If you go to organizations like the Family Firm Institute, if you deal with people in the realm of family business, most of them don't understand the trusts, the trust ownership. But if you go to, so in the world of international trusts, like the leading organization is called Society of Trust and Estate Practitioners, STEP. The people in STEP are the smartest trust experts, and they don't know the first thing about family business. So if you went to a STEP conference and you started talking about the 3-circle model of family business, they've never heard of it. So I'm lucky because I can sit in the middle and say, I understand the world of trusts and I understand the world of family business or family wealth. And surprisingly, not many people do that.
Why do you think the 3 circles would be helpful? And what is the 3 circles?
So the origin of the 3-circle model goes back to the early days of family business consulting coming out of the US. And I think the starting point was that people in the US said, when you look at a family business, like there's really 2 systems. You can think of 2 overlapping circles. One of those circles is obviously the business system or a management system. And the other circle is the family system with its family dynamics. And I think, I could be wrong, but this is my hunch. In the US, when people look at the family system, I think the family therapists, in particular the Bowen family systems people, are being very influential. And then, if I get the names, it's John Davis and Renato Taguri came along and said, there's a 3rd circle here to understand family businesses. And that 3rd circle is the ownership circle. And there's 2 interesting things about this 3-circle model, which is like a foundational model when people look at family businesses. And one of the things about this model is, and when I met Jay for the first time, he didn't exactly give me this exercise, but he gave me something similar. One of the things about the 3-circle model is that you plot the family members who are affiliated with a family-owned business into when you put the 3 circles over each other, you get 7 different areas. And so one really nifty thing about this 3-circle model is you write where everybody is today and their current ages, and then you say, okay, let's add 10 years. And what's it going to look like in 10 years' time? Like, where do we expect people to move in this model? So that's really useful. The other thing about this model, and this might come up if we talk a bit about culture, is the theory behind the model is family businesses are complex systems. Conflict is inevitable because of that complexity. Basically, you have family system is run by family system rules. Ownership has its own interests. Management is run by management thinking philosophy. So there's tensions between the way these 3 circles operate, and they have to go together. But the key insight from this model, or a key principle from this model, is that a lot of conflicts in family businesses are positional conflicts rather than personal conflicts.
How is that different, positional versus personal? Most people would probably think those were the same.
But using this 3-circle model, you could plot somebody and you say, okay, here we have one family member and they're working in the management circle of the business. And they've got a couple of siblings, and those siblings are not in management, but they're family and they're in ownership. So the 3-circle model will tell you if those siblings are fighting, then it's because the sibling in management spends all his or her day looking at the business. Whenever there's profit to reinvest, they want to maximize reinvestment in the business. The others who are in the ownership circle, but not in the business management, they have a different perspective. Like they're owners, they care about, can we maximize the dividends? Or they might say, is this guy in management getting paid too much? So this 3-circle model theory is that that conflict is not a case of sibling rivalry. That conflict is a positional conflict, which is going to occur between owners and managers. And if you moved on this kind of thinking, if you moved the sibling out of management, so he's in the same place as the other siblings, then that conflict should disappear. That's the theory. That's an example of that. So one way of thinking about conflicts in family enterprises is to ask the question of, are these positional, role-based conflicts? And my own personal experience, there's other ways of thinking about it. And this is a little bit heretical in the family business world, but my own sort of experience. So here in Asia, I'm predominantly working with sibling groups, and often the matriarch or patriarch is still alive. So I think that's one of the differences between Asia versus practice in the US or Europe, is that a lot of the families that you're facing are still in that sort of first to second to third thing. So my own personal experience is that these conflicts, they're because of sibling rivalry. They're not positional conflicts. They're relationship conflicts, which are coming out of the family system dynamics.
There's been a lot of consolidation in the legal space. I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on the way the large law firms work with families in Asia.
My understanding in the US is that the large law firms got out of private client practice. And I think if you look at like the UK or London, I think you also see a similar thing. You have some firms that are well known for like international tax planning, and that might be in a large practice. But I think in terms of the bigger law firms, so if you're a wealthy family in Asia, you could be working, there's a high chance that you're working directly with a leading London law firm. So I think the big, call them international law firms, like what would give them a lot of revenue is the trust litigation work, and maybe a little bit more closer to home. The funny thing is, I believe, so I'm not active in legal practice, but it's the matrimonial planning, which is another sort of revenue source for international law firms in Asia, doing things like prenuptial agreements or doing things like matrimonial dispute settlement. So it's different. So they're not whole. You could say there's a distinction between structure and culture work. And so I've become a disciple of Jay many years ago. So I'm very focused on the culture work. And the law firms are not. They're focused on the structure work. But the structure work is important. And like the good thing about the structural approach from this sort of international perspective is people will sit down. So when you're a trust lawyer, like you have a client, which is the wealth holder, or maybe it's a couple. And so you're not working with a family. And so and because of that, there are limitations of that. There's practice rules which make it not impossible, but make it, the mindset of the lawyer. So the lawyer's mindset, they're an expert and they have a single client to who they owe their duties to. And so that's typically the wealth holder. But the good thing about the structural approach is that they will sit down with a wealth holder and they'll say, okay, there's a protector role in these trusts. Let's think about the succession mechanism to that. So the good thing I don't want to criticize the structural people or the structural practitioners in Asia or internationally, because I think a lot of them are very seasoned, very experienced, involved in resolving a lot of disputes, bringing that expertise. When I was younger, I became a bit critical of the pure technical approach. But as I get a little bit more older and wiser, there's a lot of respect that is due to them, I think.
How did you meet Jay Hughes, and how did he change the way you looked at your work?
I landed in Hong Kong in 1994. I ended up at PricewaterhouseCoopers doing estate duty planning work in Hong Kong. In about 2002, I jumped ship. I was a salaried partner at PwC. I was offered partnership at PwC, and I walked away from it.
Why didn't you want a partnership?
The organization was going through some reorganization and reorganizational changes. And I looked at those reorganizational changes and I thought, I don't want to be part of that. And that was a key reason. And then joined JP Morgan. And for me, JP Morgan was a US private bank, but the practice was Asia. So dealing with really high quality families all across Asia, as opposed to just Hong Kong. And at JP Morgan, they had a very strong wealth advisory practice. They had a family wealth center in those days. When I first joined, there was a lady called Amy Braden in New York. So the quality of the thinking. So I joined JP Morgan and I discovered there's Asia beyond Hong Kong. And I discovered, there's this world of family business consulting and family office and family governance. And I think I was with JP Morgan for about a year when they had an American guy who was heading their Singapore office at the time. And I think this was the story, which is such a typical Jay Hughes story, is I think it was his 60th birthday and he knew this man heading Singapore. And the story was he wasn't able to get back to New York for Jay's birthday party. So Jay said, I'll give you a gift. What do you want it to be? And this guy said, come out to Singapore and do a client event for my families in Singapore. So because I was the head of wealth advisory for Asia for JP Morgan at the time, I got flown to Singapore to observe, would be a better word, this event. I see you've got that little green book sitting behind you. When I first got to JP Morgan, I was based in Hong Kong. Again, I was just lucky. I was given a desk in the back corner. I was left alone to freedom to see what I could come up with. And there were these so I inherited an empty desk. And behind this empty desk, there were two piles of books. And one pile of book was the Harvard Business Press book by Landsberg and others called Succeeding Generations. So they used to give that one to clients, and I thought, oh, what's this? And then the other one was this pile of this little green book called Family Wealth, Keeping It in the Family. And so I started reading that, and then I probably got to meet Jay about a year later. So,
And how did that change your thinking?
again, I think all these things are evolutionary. To start with, I was studying Family Wealth, Keeping It in the Family, which is a classic book. And at JP Morgan, they were giving it to their clients in Asia. And I was at that meeting in Singapore. There'd be some families or family offices that would ask for a private meeting with Jay, and they would pull out that book, and it would be like every page of the book had been annotated. I was studying that book. I was talking to Asian families about family business governance and learning and trying to figure things out. So the Jay's book gave me an inspiration. And what I was experiencing at JP Morgan was that I was having conversations with their client families in different parts of Asia. And I could see that these conversations were really interesting to them. The conversations were very much about governance structure and family business succession approaches or models. So still very structural conversations. And I guess I started incorporating concepts from Jay's book into those presentations. But maybe two things. One is that I just thought this stuff is really important. It's interesting to the clients, but it's not really going anywhere in the bank. Also, I was told in the bank in those days, so things change a lot, that like it's hard to quantify family governance work for clients. Don't do too much of it. But I thought that this was interesting. So I did a crazy thing, which was just quit my job at JP Morgan and said, I'm going to set up shop as a family governance advisor in Asia. So Jay was an inspiration. Was I talking to people about the 5 capitals model or what that even meant? So this is 2008. I didn't understand that stuff at that time. I might have been able to talk about the theory, but not know how to put it into practice. So there's an evolution. Like when you go back and read a book like Family Wealth, Keeping It in the Family, my favorite chapter in that book, there's a chapter there on mentoring. It's one of the best things that I've ever read or come across on the topic of mentoring. And it's all about the mentor intuiting the needs of the mentee. And so that's one of the things that I only realized going back and many years later and rereading this stuff. So I had this first meeting with Jay. I probably had a few other meetings when he was visiting Hong Kong. The story is still in my JP Morgan days, so maybe 2004 or something like that. I said, look, we've got this major client in Asia. It's going through a transition. Can we introduce you to help them? And he said, I'll talk to you. Let's meet when I'm back in Hong Kong again. He met. So this would be like 2004, I think. And he said, look, I'm semi-retired, which was a lie, of course. I think
He still is.
Yeah, he's still semi-retired. But he said, why don't you do it? And this was the thing about, so he said, why don't, drew a genogram, basically, draw a map do a family tree, write everybody's age, and then add 10 years. And what does that look like? Right. And there's this center at Georgetown for Bowen family systems theory. Why don't you go and read some stuff from there? So I've read, and I know this is not the same thing, Coach. So the Bowen family systems theory stuff is experiential. So I've read plenty about it. There are some accessible books on it.
I guess the question would be, did you feel like you learned anything from reading those books?
The core thing from Bowen is this idea of triangles and triangulation. Like another core thing from Bowen is obviously anxiety in a family and like what you can do to lower the anxiety, or even just being. So what I personally took away from Bowen are things like, what am I doing to manage my anxiety? I do a lot of meditation, especially before client meetings. Bowen emphasizes how could you be objective and stay in thinking mode. There's two big things I took away personally from Bowen is for the triangles, manage your own anxiety and do your own work. That's the big thing I took away from Bowen.
Why do you think meditation is helpful before the family meetings? Why do you think your own anxiety comes into this?
The meditation really helps me to calm myself down, and I need it. Like I'm a neurotic kind of person. But it helps me to keep grounded. There's meditation and there's different kinds of meditations. But I'm also very interested in this thing, like a way a lot of people would know about it is called focusing. It's a somatic practice. The idea is that we've had our conscious mind and our unconscious mind. The idea behind focusing, and the guy who articulated focusing is called Eugene Gendlin, and it's quite old. The unconscious mind is accessible through the body. You just have to learn to ask yourself a question and don't answer it with your head and wait for the sensations to come up in your body. And then today, that's very aligned today with a kind of therapy which is often used for trauma called internal family systems. Internal family systems is perhaps it's a guy called Dr. Richard Schwartz. Internal family systems is a little bit more sophisticated, like a framework, but it's basically listening to the different parts of your body. And then I've been exposed to another guy called Thomas Hübl, who has written a couple of books and is in the trauma work field. And his books are about generational trauma and collective or societal trauma. Anyway, so the very long answer to all of this is the aspiration is to be physically present with your clients. And as one of my good sort of friends and mentors says, if we're advisors, we need to be co-regulating with our clients. So that's my aspiration. That's why I meditate.
What does it mean to co-regulate?
So the easy way to understand this is, first of all, you start with yourself and like this idea of what's a felt sense. And so a good example of the felt sense is that you're heading off you leave home, you're heading off to work, and then you have a sense, I've left something behind. You just have this sense of something's, but you can't think what it is. It's not in your cognitive mind. And how do you know? Because you have a sense. You just have a sense. So with things like focusing and internal family systems, like you're cultivating the ability to be aware of your own felt senses, own internal state, but then to co-regulate is to have a felt sense of somebody else, like to be present with somebody that you're conscious of. What's the feeling that I'm having when I'm sitting with Joe? What's that physical somatic feeling in me? And I think that gets you to the co-regulation. I think that's an aspiration for advisors. Yeah. I'll give you a couple of examples of how this stuff is relevant for the practitioner. And part of our work is integrating financial capital into your life. Your relationship to money, and often part of this is inherited or ancestral. Like there are parts of you that react to money, or there are parts of you that carry stories and beliefs and messages about money. So if your goal is to integrate your relationship with financial capital, then do this kind of parts work, do this kind of focusing work, learn to get in touch with the parts and then sort out which parts are your parts and which parts might be your parents' or grandparents' parts. It's really important in that area. A second example of this kind of thing. So the thing about parts work is Dr. Richard Schwartz is part of it, is the idea that we all have like multiple personalities. Like we have multiple parts. We're different people in different situations, depending on which part's showing up. Like there are different frameworks for thinking about how people see themselves as owners in a family business or owners of inherited wealth. So you see frameworks where some people will say you can distinguish between people who have Jay's word for this is an inheritance mindset. I've inherited it, this is mine. Some people have a stewardship mindset. Another brilliant thinker in the family wealth space is Matthew Wesley. So Matt Wesley's got a different framework where he said you can have some people who are undecided. He's sojourners, he calls it. And then I have to credit Matt Wesley for pointing this out to me. These stances that people have, I don't know what the right acquire, I don't know, possess, I'm not sure the right word, they're parts. So you can have one person who there's a part of them and there are times when they feel like they're a steward. There are parts of them and there's a time of them where they feel like this is my inheritance. And there's parts language and way of thinking about parts helps you to those different conversations, different internal conversations. I'll just say one more thing about this, which is back to the Thomas Hübl. And I got this from reading a white paper. And I think the lady's name is Diana Chapman. I'm not sure about that. The idea is that if you're not aware of the different parts running around in your own body, if you can't integrate and process the different parts in your body, if you can't bring what's in your body into self-awareness, which is a practice, etc., then you can't really open up to the future. And so people like Jay will say it's really important that an inheritor can integrate financial capital into their life. And this parts approach gives you one way of doing it at a somatic level. And the reason for doing it is so that you can be more trying to think of there's different ways of experiencing the world. So maybe this is a little bit too much. But one framework is that some people experience the world like they're victims. Another way of experiencing the world, which is like a level up, is people have a strong sense of agency. Like another level up is, so almost a higher level of consciousness, is that people can be open to what the world wants for them. So the idea is that if you do this parts work, you can become more open to what the world wants you to do with your money. Yeah.
Is there a way that you can get to that point?
Yes. Again, so there's a personal practice part of this, but I would look at the work of Thomas Hübl. So you need some kind of inner somatic practice. So start with focusing, start with internal family systems. If you're from a wealthy family or a family office, this is Jay's insight. It's use financial capital to help grow the qualitative capitals of the family. Get a therapist, get an IFS coach, get a somatic coach. That's step one. You have to cultivate your own personal practice.
What's IFS?
Internal family systems, which is the Richard Schwartz version of the same thing. But then you get back. So step one is doing your own cultivation on a regular basis. But step two is doing it with other people, which gets you back to that co-regulation point. You have to learn how to do it with other people. And Thomas Hübl says if we're aiming to integrate past traumatic energies or legacy parts, it's got to be collective, is what he says. So fine. But I think the practical step is you've got to find a partner that you can do this kind of work with on a regular basis. So you're practicing co-regulation.
You said once most family conflicts are predictable. Why is that?
Maybe I would retract that statement, because that kind of goes back to this 3-circle model that we were talking about before, which is, call it a family business or a family enterprise, or even if it's financial capital under a trust, etc. It's just complex. One of my points is that if it's a family business, why is it complex? It's because the family system wants one. The ownership system has a financial focus. The management system is very focused on business performance, meritocracy, etc., etc. Right. It's complex. How do you manage those minimum of 3 different competing things? So the 3-circle model language tells you it's predictable. There's going to be a conflict between the family members who are shareholders and the ones who are working in the business. So when you say it's predictable, that's predictable. The system is complex. There can be these positional conflicts. The positional conflicts are predictable. Yeah, where I am today is a good practitioner way of thinking about conflicts is there are 3 different kinds of conflicts. Like one is an issue conflict, and you call that a healthy conflict as long as it doesn't go on forever, like debating, challenging different points of view. So that's healthy. The second kind of conflict is called process conflict. You have process conflict because you don't have governance. So put the governance in place or increase the skills and you can take away process conflict. So I think the 3-circle model is pointing at this positional governance process stuff. 3-circle model thinking is it's predictable there's going to be a conflict between outside shareholders and people working in the business. So what can we do to make sure we have communication forums and a balancing mechanism between those 2 different stakeholder groups? Process conflict. But like my own practice is a lot of siblings. And I think it's relationship conflict. It's relationship with the parents. Is that predictable? I would say the relationship stuff is going to be generational unless you deal with it, multi-generation, pass from generation to generation unless you deal with it.
So how can you prevent sibling conflicts before the founding couple dies?
Tying this back to Jay in a couple of ways and a few other things. Like what Jay is really saying is that if you want to perpetuate a family business or perpetuate family wealth, what's important is building a family of affinity. It's the family that's important. And though family have to be responsible owners and find competent governors and managers, but the question is, how do you build the family of affinity? Then you look at Dennis Jaffe, and Dennis has done this huge research on 100-year family, 100-year very significant family-owned businesses. And Dennis said the same thing as Jay. He says, when I look at these, and his book is like an encyclopedia. It's worth looking at this book from Dennis. He said in all these families, the first generation creates the business, and then the second generation decides we're going to be a great family. So Dennis and Jay are basically saying, Jay says you've got to have a family of affinity. Dennis says you've got to create a generative family, which means a care for. And then Jay says, look at what is the wealth of your family? Use your financial capital so that you can grow human, intellectual, social, spiritual capital. So what does that practically mean? It practically means that, Joe, if you're in a family of wealth and you want to work on increasing your capacity to be able to productively manage conflict, the family should go and pay for you to go and do a course with Thomas Hubel or someone to learn IFS. The family should be paying for you paying for your therapy sessions. And so I'm talking in this specific context here of learning these skills of internal family systems and focusing things. And then you take it a step further. It's if the family's investing in this stuff and it's important, then, and it's big enough and it's complex enough, it's like the family should be hiring that therapist to come and work for them on a retained basis. And that sort of merges into the chief learning officer idea. So one of Jay's key points is invest in building this ability to self-regulate, co-regulate. Another way of thinking about this stuff is, so I said before, we started off talking about trust structures. The structure is really important, but you can't use, and this is a Matt Wesley saying, you can't use the trust structure to bottle up the family emotions. You have to work on the culture as well. So you need to work on culture and structure in tandem. So what you do with your group of siblings is you say, look, maybe we need to make sure everybody understands the terms of the family trust structure so we don't have disputes because people don't understand the structure. When you're doing governance work, you want the family to co-develop the work. And like governance is another learning experience in itself. Governance is learning to work together. So you could have parallel tracks where you say, okay, we have a process here of where we're creating our governance, etc. And at the same time, we need to do the culture work. If there's conflict in past generations, or if we all didn't have the best parenting, the aspiration is you should have this group of siblings should be doing work with a coach or a therapist or a healer. Like, they've got to work on it. You've got to invest in the family culture. But what I've seen is when you see a sibling group say, look, we're going to collectively work on our issues together. I've seen in families that, like the third generation, they look up and they're like, wow, that's what it means to become a family of affinity. That's what it means to be a generative family. That they're leading by example by doing their own inner work, really, or collectively doing inner work. Yeah.
How do you advise family members to let go of grudges?
I need to perfect this one myself. One way is there's supposed to be a polarity between gratitude and resentment. So like gratitude is a practice. One approach is you say, who can I look at everybody in my family or, the family office system or whatever, go through the list and say, can I be grateful to each of these people? And as you're going through your list and you say, yes, and gratitude itself is like really powerful and an important practice in the context of family trusts, beneficiaries of family trusts. But if you're going through your list and you say, yes, I can be grateful to this person, yes, this person, but I can't be grateful to that person, then that will say, okay, then there's resentment. Where you can't be grateful, there's resentment. So one approach is you start to cultivate gratitude intentionally, more broadly, but then over time, coming to focus around that specific person. Can you build up that thing? So to me, a lot of this stuff is personal practice. There's cognitive worksheets. There's this amazing worksheet which works really well for me called the Active Insight worksheet, which a very good friend of mine put me onto. And there's the Judge Your Neighbor worksheet from Byron Katie. Because when you get angry or stressed at someone, like your perspective narrows. You just can't see things from their point of view, or you can't see things objectively. Both of these worksheets are about helping you to get a little bit more perspective. So if I'm an advisor working with a family, I would sit them down and say, look, let's start working on these worksheets. And then that's a second approach. A third approach is just the parts work. There's a part of you that has a grudge. There's a core self in you which doesn't have a grudge. So why have you got a grudge? With my clients, if they'll go there, then I'm a big fan of getting them to work with somatic healers. Then the somatic healer can say, Joe, this is your grudge. Or actually, this is your great-grandfather's grudge. Ask him to deal with it. So there's that somatic approach. Then the last thing is getting into, which is a practice. So if you're like a chief learning officer, then like on my idea of a curriculum for a family, which is, theory is one thing, practice is always much more difficult, but I have to learn about forgiveness. Forgiveness involves building a muscle.
Family constitutions can be a bit intimidating. How do you generally start the conversation with a family?
Let me come at it a little bit like this. Part of it is this structure and culture debate. So we know that culture will eat structure for breakfast. There's a really great article on Jay Hughes' foundation website on culture eating structure for breakfast. But you've got to have both. So in Asia, a lot of the older generation, they're very structural. Like that's what they want to do. They don't want to have family meetings, etc. They want to start with a trust, or they want to start with a constitution. And when I was younger, or starting out, I would say, yeah, but you haven't looked at the culture. You haven't done the culture work. That's not going to work. I think where I am today is great. You've got that building block in place. You've got the trust work done. Okay, do we need to revisit it, or what's next? So I think about a lot of these structural things today as like a stepping stone. And it's great that you've got this stepping stone in place. Similar kind of thing with the family constitutions is that you'll see in Asia sibling groups that spend a lot of time developing family constitutions, and they don't involve the rising gen, even if the rising gen are young adults. So I've seen instances where I've done this myself. I've worked for 5 years with one sibling group and said, we should include the rising gen. And they said, no, you don't understand. We're an Asian family. When we're done, we'll tell them what it is. And when we were done and when we told them what it is, didn't stick, it didn't work. Got to involve both generations. The way I think about it today is, that's great. Okay, you've done all this work. That's a foundation. That's a stepping stone. What's next? My own personal story was a little bit about when I first became a consultant, which was 2000 and onwards. Like my thing was family constitutions. Then I realized after a couple of those that they were, when the family constitution project was done, nothing was happening. So to me today, it's all about, I'm a little bit extreme today. I'm almost a little bit like, why does anyone need a family constitution? Which is not helpful. That's going to the opposite end of the spectrum. Role clarity is important. Being clear on who makes the major decisions and this is an important point, who has a voice in major decisions. That kind of clarity is important. But it's really about a practice. You can have a constitution and you can have policies, right? Everybody knows that. And then people say there's also things like shareholder agreements or alternative dispute resolution agreements. So you have constitutions, you have legal agreements. Every family that I've worked for, after a certain point, I basically end up doing a PowerPoint summary of the family constitution. I think the term was like a family constitution handbook. People can understand in simple terms, what is our constitution? But so that's 3 categories of documents that I've talked about. 1 is the constitutional policy. 2 is the legal agreements, which are important. I think those should be separate. Then there's the manual for the family to actually understand things if it's complicated. But maybe more importantly than all of those things is a 4th kind of document. And that 4th document is it's just a table which says, here's a list of all the major decisions. And is this decision made by the CEO? Is this decision made by the corporate board? Is this decision made by the shareholders council? Is this decision made by the family council? And for each, so then you identify where's the decision-making body. And then for each of those, then you say, who do you have to consult with first? Which is the voice and vote. And so where I am today is that role clarity is really important for families. The constitution stuff, it's about the practices of the family. It's about what the family do in practice. Are they learning and evolving? Yeah, I'm not a big family constitution fan.
Outside of the legal documents, how would you assure accountability to the Constitution and the process afterwards?
It's not easy in practice. That's why it's like it needs to be a constant process. So if the family's wealthy enough or complicated enough, or they've got their own family office, then they need administrative support for these governance documents. Like they need a professional. In theory, it could be a family member, but fine if that will work in practice. But they really need a professional who's on top of all the governance documents and reminds them what's in their governance. So administrative support is a basic thing. The second thing is, and this fits really well in the Asian culture, is, and this is Jay's idea is that there's 3 pillars of family governance. The first pillar is the family assembly. The second pillar is the family council. The third pillar is the family elders or council of elders. And the role of family elders is to remind there's a couple of roles, but one of the roles is to remind the family members what their agreements are. Family business setting, you can also have independent non-executive directors who can also help to play those roles, reminding people. So that's a governance answer. Then there's the family dynamics and the family culture, because you can't assume that people will. So it's important. My experience in Asia is that just try and keep it simple, have that role clarity, have an agreed process for who decides on things and who has a voice before a decision is made. You need professionals to keep reminding the family to do what they've said they're going to do. Like keeping records of past discussions and resolutions, like minuting things. Paperwork is incredibly important. So you can pull out the paperwork and say, hey, we talked about this 2 years ago and this is what everybody agreed. Yet with all of this stuff, and maybe this is not limited to Asian families. So all of this stuff is working at the sort of maybe that process level or that governance level. And it's really valuable, but it needs maintenance and support. But I had an example very recently where, and I've seen this play out with a Western family, and I've seen this play out with an Asian family. And hopefully, in both of these cases, the situation could be saved. I literally had a client, and he was under a lot of stress at the time. It's a patriarchal family, and can have somebody say, just on the authority of my position in the family, I'm not going to follow the Constitution. In this case, it was, I'm too busy. And the guy he was under a lot of stress and etc. And so there's a limit. So this is culture, eating structure for breakfast. The other thing I've been thinking about a lot recently is, so role clarity is really important. Like longevity of Asian family firms needs emotionally committed stakeholder owners, and it needs owners who are competent to make decisions together. You need to have, what are the decisions the shareholders make, or what are the decisions the shareholders are consulted on? Where do they have a voice? So this voice and vote distinction is like really important, but it takes coaching and practice to bring it to life. And you're usually trying to change the culture. In Asian family firms, there is no such thing as a shareholder role. So of course I'm dealing with 1 to 2 or a controlling owner or sibling ownerships. They don't really have, in Asia, nobody focuses on the shareholder role. So when you talk about accountability to shareholders or giving shareholders a voice or beneficiaries a voice before vote, like you're really trying to create something new for the first time. And so the simple idea here, which is really important in practice, is that you need to coach and develop people to earn a voice. They've got to be credible. And the people with the authority, the vote, you've got to coach them to listen first before making decisions.
You've referred to succession as a design process. How do you broach the issue of succession in Asian families?
If the controlling owner walks in and they say, my siblings are fighting, what do I do about it? Then that's an open invitation into working with the family. But a more formal answer maybe is, in the founder's mind, and this is a Jay point, it's in one of his books as well. In the founder's mind, the only thing they think about or care about is the management circle. You have to show them the research from Jay and Dennis and the stats about Chinese family firms. You have to say, look, actually ownership is more important than management. And the family of affinity, the generative family, that's even more important. Right? The culture here is the older generation. It's a collective culture, giving them the concept that, okay, you need to invest in family harmony. They can get that concept. So typically the controlling owner is thinking about who's going to take over and lead the business. But really the question is going to be, okay, how do we cultivate competent ownership? Or even if you're just giving them a voice, not a vote, what about the board? So that's where you say, it's okay, if we need to start building out this idea that there's a board. We need to start building out this idea that there's a shareholder role and what's the forum for shareholders. We need to think about, where's the forum for working on culture? Where's the forum for helping family members? And when you start to add these different elements to the map, then you say, okay, like now we need people in the ownership forum. We need people on the board. We need people in the management, and management is an accountability role. So that's what I mean by it's a design process, because the system needs to be designed. And when you design the system, then you can bite the succession task up into little pieces, making it easier.
And then how do you get buy-in?
It is a patriarchal culture, so you're not always going to get buy-in. The idea, so generalizing a lot. People want a structure that's going to fix things for them. And so if you tell them it's all about a family of affinity or it's about a generative family, they may not be open to hearing that, or they think it's not an issue. How do you get them to buy into that? I tend to try to lead with research and just say, look, if this business is important for you, For me, it's more often about the business than financial capital. Then this is what the research says. We need to do this work. We need engaged, emotionally committed, competent owners who can make decisions together. Usually you go step by step. My sort of classic approach has been to say, if the Asian patriarch came to me and said, I want a constitution, then I'd say, great, let's start working on a constitution. But to do that, we need to have family meetings. And in our family meetings, we need to do two things. One, we need to be working on, you could say, I don't put it this way. You could say in those meetings, we need to be working on the structure collectively, and we need to be working on the culture at the same time. So building the skills to how to collaborate or learn about each other or giving each other feedback in the meetings.
Any advice for cultivating leadership in the next generation?
The starting point is that often the older generation is very Confucian or collective harmony in culture in that sense. It is very common in Asia that the younger generation have had the best Western education and work experience and competency. So that rising generation, they're bicultural. They have to come back to Asia or participate and learn how to be flexible in terms of still dealing with their Confucian elders. So, of course, the Western answer is go away and individuate. So the thing about Asian families, that's very generalizing. The thing about Asian families is that there's often this sort of stronger family pull together. And the challenge is actually encouraging people to individuate. So I'm thinking as I go to answer your question. One thing, again, is coming back to designing the structure, is realizing it's a bit of a balancing act, maybe more so of a balancing act with an Asian family, is that message that ownership is important. Let's build an ownership cohort, or let's build a rising generation of competent, responsible beneficiaries. And they can do that and individuate and be separate and apart from the family. So let's try to do both. Let's try to help them. Again, this is Jay. It's what can the family do to help its rising generation to know themselves, individuate, to find their own, strengths and dreams and etc. So how can the family should be helping everybody in the rising generation with some kind of know thyself process. And so then in an ideal world, you'd say, look, we're helping people to go out. We're helping people to build skills which they maybe are using in their work away from the family enterprise. We'd like to encourage them to come back, and they can come. We'd like to encourage them to participate. And there are multiple places where they can be participating. There are many different rooms to help out in. So which room in the system? Is it the foundation? Is it the owners forum? Do you think it's going to be the board? Which room in the system is of interest to you? And really, the message I give to the family rather than the individual is the important thing is we need a cohort of responsible beneficiaries, or we need a cohort of responsible stakeholder owners. That's what our IM is for the next generation. And then out of that, we're probably looking for a smaller group of people who are going to go be competent in the board roles. And maybe the next generation leader is the person who's going to lead the governance. It's not the person who's going to lead the business. For leadership, there are different frameworks around basically vertical development, which are adult developmental stages, which are applied in the leadership context. So I pulled out some of these frameworks and said, and this is usually to older people, and said, where do you think you are on this level? And can you please go and get some feedback on where other people think you are? But knowing yourself is like, a lot of that stuff is really important. And like in leadership, one of my favorite quotes is Otto Scharmer saying the most underrated of leadership skills is listening. And he talks about generative listening and like listening for where you're wrong, listening for what's emerging. So leadership is a key listening skill. Sorry, listening is a key leadership skill. With the families I work with, so for me, if I'm working with a family, then I would find a coach that I'm also working with and we'll go to the family and say, you've got to grow your human capital, intellectual capital, social capital as part of this process. Let's get everybody having an Enneagram assessment. So you know what everybody's Enneagram type is. Let's get everybody doing like a vocational assessment. Let's get everybody assessed on how they learn to work together in a group. And so this assessment process gives people self-knowledge with support from the coach or with support from the chief learning officer. But it also helps them to, if they know how to do work in a group for themselves, then they know how to lead a group in that same way. There's a few ideas.
Christian, Stewart, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights with us today.
Thank you so much, Joe. This has been a pleasure. Meeting in person, I think, for the first time, and having this opportunity to just think out loud.
Thanks for listening. If you like the podcast, please share it with your friends and take a minute to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. We appreciate it.